Hello, thanks for joining us. My special guest today is Peter Hitchens, award-winning journalist, author and broadcaster. Peter has covered some of the great groundbreaking events of our time, including the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's also reported from inside Iran and North Korea. Peter, welcome. Thanks very much for your time today.
Pleasure to be here.
You've said on a number of occasions that whilst your family wasn't particularly church-going, your education here in England was imbued with Christian tradition and values.
Well, of a sort. That kind of Christianity very mixed up with patriotism, which the Church of England had pretty much become by the time I was a child. It's summed up. You go to any English cathedral and you see hanging in the side chapels old battle flags. There is this complete entanglement of the valorous history of the country as a warrior country and of the church itself. So the two were inseparable. They were also severely mixed up, and I think the religious part of it was pretty heavily compromised by the patriotic part of it. I also grew up in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. To all intents and purposes, we were behaving as if it was still going on. All my storybooks were about it. All my toys were war toys. Everything was overshadowed by it. The towns and cities I was living in, naval bases, were war damaged. It was the thing which obsessed us. And the real religion of England that I was brought up with was the religion which I call "we won the war," which a lot of people still believe in.
And when you were 15, you say that you burned your Bible and declare yourself quite openly an atheist. Were they the major contributing factors to that decision? It seems like a young
Well,
age.
I don't want to make excuses for myself. And the main reason that anybody has for becoming an atheist, if they've got any sense, is that it liberates them from obligations which are tiresome and which get in the way of doing what you want to do. If you're an atheist, then the only commandment you need to follow is do what thou wilt, and followed up by the second one, don't get found out doing it. And I wanted that. So this isn't a matter of making excuses for myself before the court of eternal justice. I'm simply saying, as a matter of fact, that it's undoubtedly the case that I got to this state of mind, partly because what I'd been brought up to believe in was collapsing in ruins all around me. I'd been brought up for a world that no longer existed. My childhood, though it technically took place in the 1950s and early 60s, was in many cases indistinguishable from the childhood of an English middle-class boy of the 1930s. And of course, when the 1960s came, and we'd had, first of all, the Suez Crisis in 1956, which had ruined my father's naval career because it had ruined the Navy, and the Profumo affair, the great political scandal, as it were, the original political scandal of modern Britain in 62, 63, the whole ability of people in this country to believe in the things that they'd been brought up to believe in was damaged from the bottom up. And I couldn't fail but notice that. It was harder to take your teachers seriously, harder to take your parents seriously, harder to take your country seriously. And if you'd been brought up to believe quite strongly in something that was obviously failing, then it put your mind into some sort of turmoil. Again, this isn't a self-pitying complaint. It's just an explanation of how I think I came to that point.
And you've said, in looking back at that time, that you felt as a young man that science had explained all the great questions. There were no mysteries in the universe.
Well, we were taught science as a collection of things to be known. I have to say I wasn't very interested in it as a result. If it had been taught to me as a debate, as a series of questions still in the course of being resolved, of matters which were open, of things which were as yet not disproved but weren't that rigid, I'd possibly have been more interested in it. But I think the 19th century idea of science, which seems to be the idea which many of the modern atheists have, that it either had explained everything or that what it hadn't explained wasn't worth explaining or would soon be found out about, was very prevalent in what we were taught. I don't, for instance, remember ever being taught the theory of evolution by natural selection. It was just assumed to be the case by everybody who taught me. And so one absorbed it as a belief rather more than as a theory, as I think many people still do. That's an example. But if you look at the modern atheist view of science, it's like the view of someone who thinks a paddle steamer is the topmost pinnacle of modern technology. It's a very, very 19th century view of science, which I think has been exploded in the years since I was at school almost completely. Really, a better word for it would be materialistic scientism rather than science as such. Right. The confusion between a specific theory of science, as materialistic scientism is, and science in general as an explanatory force has been a very serious disability really for people making religious arguments. Most people think that most people do genuinely think that science has made belief in God impossible and laughable.
Yes. I wonder how...
And if you knew anything about science, you know that wasn't the case.
No, it's true in the history of science, but it was the French thinker, I think, Jacques Ellul, who said, we may end up building faster and faster machines to take us nowhere. I wonder how you feel about technology now. Are you wary of its role in the future? Are you fearful of its role in the future?
Well, I'm not particularly fearful of technology itself. It depends on who controls it and what they do with it. I do think that it's been in many serious cases abused. I suspect that the decision to probe into the secrets of nuclear fission was a mistake, which we may well come to regret. I don't know. I think it's difficult to know. One doesn't want to sound Luddite or being against technical progress, but have we actually gained as much from it as we lost by discovering it? And I'm not by any means sure. But to have a kind of generalist view about technology seems to me to be impossible. It has to be judged both on its merits as an advance and on the way in which it's used. Television, for instance. I remember there were debates in the 1950s about its awesome power to educate. Well, I think we now see that it had no such awesome power. Its awesome power is that of atrophying the imagination of children as they're growing up and of spreading conformism. But it didn't need to be like that, and it's possible it could have been used in other ways. But the fact is it has been used, by and large, in a way which, if not actively malevolent, has certainly been destructive of a lot of our culture.
I want to come to that issue of the culture in just a moment too. There's some things I want to ask you about that. Coming back to your atheism for a moment, I wonder how much of your belief system as a young man, as a young atheist, was based on the hope that there is no God or a personal preference for a universe?
No, very much so. But as I say, I don't think any intelligent person can choose to be an atheist. And I don't think you can become an atheist without choosing to be one, without making that choice. And I quote at length in my book, The Rage Against God, from the passage in Somerset Maugham's wonderful autobiographical novel of Human Bondage, in which he describes his own self-liberation when he decided not to believe in God, because I think it's an unusually honest and clear declaration of exactly what goes through the minds of people who say, right, I'm not believing this anymore, because it means I no longer am bound by these rules. I can now behave differently, live differently, have different hopes and expectations. What annoys me about so many atheists is they say, oh, well, I can't believe. I've been forced into atheism by science, and it's an evasion. Or I have no belief, one said to me the other day, which is just a linguistic dodge of saying, well, it's like I haven't got my briefcase today, or I left my umbrella at home, as if a belief were an inert thing which you carried about and could put down and not have, rather than part of yourself which you decide to do. Of course, atheists decide to disbelieve, and it's the very interesting atheist American philosopher Thomas Nagel who's asked this question: why is it that atheists so much want to believe there is no God? And I think that far more of them should ask that question, because it's really what this debate is about. Why do they want there not to be a God so much? And why, when asked, won't they say? Well, I have a few guesses at the answer to that.
So, I mean, in that book, actually, you spoke about the fact that whilst your brother Christopher maintained his atheism, you came to a strong Christian belief.
Well, it wouldn't be called strong by most Christians. I think an awful lot of Christians, would, especially of the more evangelical type, would regard me as only a few inches short of being an atheist myself. I'm not. It always annoys me when I'm described in the British media as a devout Christian. I'm not a devout Christian. All I attempt to do is to be a normal backsliding Christian of the type that existed when this was still a Christian country. I don't make any claims to special devotion or piety or strength of belief. I'm racked with doubt. I'm not particularly observant, and there are a number of things which I fail to do all the time. So no, not strong, just ordinary, and possibly worse than that.
Well, perhaps you're being humble. Perhaps.
No, I'm not. I'm just stating the truth. I think that it isn't necessary to be devout or to have passionate or ferocious beliefs to see that there are perfectly good reasons for believing in God.
So was coming to any sort of faith in Christ, was that a purely intellectual exercise for you? How did you come to that point?
Well, I don't know whether intellectual might be being a bit flattering to it, to be perfectly honest. I just decided that it seemed to me to be so, that there was strong evidence pointing towards it, but not proof, that the consequences of it, both in my own life and in my understanding of the universe and my ability to conceive of myself as a free person, that is to say, able to judge the consequences of my actions, made it, to me, a preferable choice. But I recognise that it was a choice. There were no trances and no swoons and no visions. It was just a matter of saying, yes, this is something which it seems to me that it is right to believe in, and which explains the world and the universe better than anything else that I know, and provides a compass for use in the forest of doubt, confusion, and fear in which we find ourselves.
In the 1990s, the beginning of the 90s, you were covering as I said, the breakup of the Soviet Union from within, really. When you went there, you've written that you saw no real connection between personal faith and the shape of society, that faith was a personal thing between you and God.
It hadn't crossed my mind at that stage.
Your experience in the Soviet Union changed that, though, didn't it?
Well, yes, completely, because it was quite plain that the country had made an enormous effort. I mean, the state and the Communist Party had made an enormous effort to extirpate Christian faith and to nationalize conscience, so that the private conscience and Christian faith were things which had more or less ceased to exist, except in small, isolated pockets, and people lived as servants of and the possessions of the state and of the Communist Party, and this changed the way they behaved. It meant that people, except in private among trusted people, behaved completely differently from the way they behaved in an advanced Western country with a long Christian tradition. And also they behaved completely differently, I believe, from the way in which Russians before the revolution and before the extirpation of religion would have behaved. And I think the Orthodox Christianity had been almost an essential part of the Russian person and character before the Bolsheviks got to work on stamping out Christianity, which was one of their first acts, by the way, and not something they sort of hit on later, but something which came right at the beginning of their lawmaking and reforms. And they set out to create a new man, Homo Sovieticus. And Homo Sovieticus turned out to be very inferior to the Christian Russians that they'd abolished, and in many cases massacred in very large numbers.
Was that experience in the Soviet Union part of your coming to faith, or was it?
No, I was already there. People read what I write in telescope things and read in implications that aren't there. And I was already there in terms of the reasoned decision to embrace faith, and had been for some time. It was the understanding that it had much wider implications than I previously grasped.
And having spent time in North Korea as well, seeing the...
Well, not very long. They don't let you in for long.
No, but long enough, longer than most of us get. Do you think there are lessons that we in the West should be learning from these atheistic states that we refuse to learn?
Well, I think that what people must understand is that the impulse, the utopian impulse, the idea that ye shall be as gods and that we can create a heaven on earth, is still very powerful in the human breast, and a lot of people still feel it. And it is the mainspring and the driving force of radical politics in many, many forms. And that this is where it leads. Utopia can only ever be approached across a sea of blood. And the trouble is that it's never actually reached. And this is something which needs to be understood. And you can find so many common strands between the utopian communism of the early part of the 20th century, for instance, and the middle part of the 20th century, and the intellectual shape of the new atheists, who are much more interested in society and politics than atheists have ever been before, that it ought to make you alarmed. It ought to make you say these people have got too much in common for them to be dismissed as a minor social or political force. What they're talking about is a fundamental change in our society, one which most of us believed was no longer a threat after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. But on the contrary, the threat now comes from within our own intellectuals, our own academies, our own media, our own broadcasting organizations, and indeed many other parts of our society where rationalist, secularist atheism is now a very, very common and quite a militant and increasingly intolerant belief. And it's intolerance which shows very much its potentially totalitarian character. And I point in the book to passages in which people who claim to be modern 21st century liberals actively call for the banning of the teaching of Christianity and for the censorship of Christian texts.
In another of your books, The Abolition of Britain, there's a great section called Born Yesterday, and there's a statement I want to read. It says, most of us were born yesterday, to all intents and purposes. The law of the tribe, the stories of our ancestors, the memories which our parents held in common have simply ceased to be. You're arguing there, I think, that we're losing our cultural memory and therefore our cultural identity.
Not losing, lost.
Lost.
Gone.
Completely.
Irrecoverably, as far as I can see.
Isn't culture changing?
Most people under 40 in this country live in a moronic inferno of total ignorance of their past and of the cultural context of the place in which they live. They don't understand it. They're living in the ruins of a lost civilization that they don't understand. They don't know how they come to be there. They don't know why it is as it is, and they have no idea that they might have any duty to maintain it either. It's not their fault. It was stolen from them, but it just is the case, and I don't see any way back from it.
And that's obviously having an impact on our social fabric in many ways.
Disastrous, yeah. And how can you maintain a society based upon human liberty when people don't value that liberty, don't know where it came from, what its historical origins were, don't even understand how it was fought for, don't understand the connection between what their forebears did and what they now have. Don't, for instance, in many cases, even know that we possess a Bill of Rights.
Actually, when you were a card-carrying atheist, you said, I regarded marriage as something to be avoided, abortion as a sensible necessity, homosexuality as very nearly admirable. Today, I suppose most of your journalistic peers would see you as an arch-conservative on all of those issues.
Well, if you want to discuss those issues, I'll tell you my nuanced positions on them. But I think that the point that I was making was that these were positions which I had held, which I think an awful lot of my critics hold now. And find me alarming and annoying because they think, well, if he could have believed what I think now, and now thinks what he does think, might that happen to me? And they're afraid of it. And one of the reasons why people like me are greeted so often with anger and spite and personal dislike is because we represent a fear that we speak doubts which they themselves suppress. And rather than address those doubts, let alone debate with them, they get angry with them and they personally ostracize the people who express them. And this is very often the result. I know I've done this myself. I think we've all done it, if we're honest. If you see someone expressing a doubt which you yourself hold, but which you're trying to suppress, what do? Do you say, oh, good, somebody else is expressing the same doubt as me? No, you don't. You get very angry with him. And that's what happens to me. I understand it. It doesn't make it any more fun than it would otherwise be, but it is very, very rare to be able to reason anybody out of a position he hasn't been reasoned into in the first place.
Would you describe yourself as a tolerant person? Do you think there should be limits to tolerance?
I think tolerance is completely essential. I think tolerance lies, amongst other things, in the understanding that you cannot know that you're right about the most fundamental things in life. And if you can't know that you're right, then you can't kill somebody for being wrong, can you? The problem with secularists is that they don't actually have that safety mechanism. They don't necessarily have the ability to recognize that they might be wrong. Because if the universe is a purely material universe and nothing needs to be explained beyond that, then indeed they can convince themselves that they're wholly right, that their prescriptions are wholly right. And then what happens to the unteachable morons who don't agree with them? Off to the canals. It always happens. It's almost boring in its predictability, and yet they keep trying it again and again, saying it won't happen this time.
You've spoken about educational reformers as having one great motive in mind, and that is to totally re-engineer society and its values. Is this social engineering going on?
This is the British, particularly the British experience, that the education reforms of the past more than half century actually have been aimed not at educational improvement but at social egalitarianism. So they've fundamentally had a political purpose. And if that means that the education the schools provide is worse, then it doesn't matter. That's the only explanation I can come up with for the way in which we have embarked on extremely expensive, long-lasting educational reforms from which the elite will not be detached, which they themselves are immune from, which have destroyed, in many cases, the quality of education, particularly for the children of the poor. And one of the most significant parts of that point is that the elite themselves take very, very careful steps to ensure that their children don't undergo the egalitarian treatment that the children of the poor undergo.
which is a similar situation to the elites in communist states, really, isn't it? They
It's
look after
identical.
themselves.
It's identical, except that it doesn't. It's done more openly. In the communist states, the elite schools were not acknowledged. Shkola Nomer 1 in Moscow, the elite school into which you could only get with an enormous amount of power and influence behind you, was not officially acknowledged, nor the Lenin High School in Havana or the Mangyongdai High School in Pyongyang are not acknowledged as being elite schools. They just are. Whereas I could find you in London several schools which are officially comprehensive, which are actually highly selective, which the elite attend, and I can publish that fact. That's the difference. Not anybody takes any notice when I do, but I can publish it.